What's up, y'all? Today we're talking about the best secondary role to queue as if you are a mid laner. I'm going to leave timestamps below if you guys want to hop to the role you want to hear me talk about. Each slide, I'm going to talk about a role. I'm going to talk about champions I recommend for playing that role secondary. And let's just hop into it. So before we get started, there's a couple things I want to talk about. First, mid is a highly contested role. So if you're going to queue mid primary, you have to know that we're going to get our off role more often than other roles. We have to know what we're going to do with that. Right? Some people say, I am only going to play mid and I'm a one trick. So I'm only going to play my one trick in the mid lane. Well, if you get off rolled, that means you have to ask for mid. And if they don't give you mid, you have to dodge, right? Or your win rate will go down. So those kinds of players, you're going to have to handle like playing on a second account after you use up your 2 dodges for the day, right? And that kind of thing. We call that multi-accounting. If you don't want to do that, then we have to decide, well, what do we want to play secondary? And then how are we going to keep it in a way where we still are learning and we're still improving and we're still winning? So every time we get off-rolled, it's not just an insta loss, right? So that leads me to the second kind of thing to consider before we go. We want to keep our second role as simple as possible, right? We don't want to have this whole complicated thing that we're barely even touching, so we're never going to understand. We're going to play simple champions. We're only going to play 1, maybe 2 champions in our secondary role. I'm going to pick something that makes sense to us. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started with the first role that I want to talk about is ADC. Now ADC is actually the role that I'm queuing secondary right now. I queue mid ADC and it's my favorite and it has been ever since I started playing it. The pros to ADC is that it's very micro intensive. It's very mechanically demanding. It's very teamfight and skirmish orientated. So if you're really good at team fighting and you play these front to back mages in mid lane, this role will have very similar kind of play style in terms of the fights. And it's really easy to last hit on ADCs because they're ranged and they have lots of attack damage, right? So if you're used to last hitting on mages like Annie or Victor or Orianna, lasting on any of these AD champions is just going to be 100 times easier, right? So that feels really good. Or if you're playing a melee AD champion, these guys are ranged. So again, easier to last hit. Now the cons are that the macro is very different. You have a very different perspective of the game in the early game, right? You have to understand you are responsive to your team. You don't get to be the person taking up the pressure and making the early plays. You kind of react to the early plays. If your support goes in for a play, you help, you go execute on that. If your jungle and team want to start a team fight, you go play that team fight well. But if they don't want to do that, you don't get to do that, right? You have to be very good at kind of matching your tempo with your team. And then the other con is that the role may be too mechanical. So ADC is not for everybody. It's only for mid laners who you feel like your mechanics are your highlight as a player, right? If you play Yasuo mid, if you play super intensive mid laners, if you're very high APM and you feel like that's your laning phase and your raw, just out mechanical prowess is what's beating people, then ADC will be a very good role for you, right? You focus on last hitting, you play a very simple ADC, something like Jinx or Sivir or Misfortune. I personally only play Jinx and Sivir when I play bot lane. And I'm like, look, I'm just going to last hit and then I'm going to play the fight better than you and I'm going to win, right? I don't know the matchups as well. And I'm sure that means I win less bot lanes, but it doesn't matter because I'm playing these champions that are simple. They're very fundamental. And when we get into the team fights, I'm going to use my fundamental mechanics and out team fight you, right? So that's kind of my thing. So ADC, if you don't know what to start with, I think is a really good secondary role. And right behind it is support. Support, I think, is the most commonly recommended. And if you have no clue where to start, this is a very, very good spot to start. And there's a bunch of reasons. The main reason is the macro is very similar to mid lane, right? Mid lane's all about kind of moving with your jungler and applying early pressure and having control over the whole map. Support is the same thing, except it's even more early game focused, right? So you're all about getting all your lanes ahead, winning bot lane, winning jungle, winning mid lane, having this map pressure, playing on your strong side, that kind of thing. And if you're a really good mid laner, your lane phase on support will be really strong. So you'll be able to just win a lot of bot lanes through your raw lane power. And you don't have to worry about last hitting, right? And it's very quick to pick up because supports tend to be, they have high base stats and they tend to be slightly easier champions than like mid laners. So support is super quick to pick up. If you don't know where to start, this is the best place to start. It's easy to pick up. Your skills from mid lane will mostly transfer over. The biggest con and the biggest thing I notice in my mid lane clients when they get off-road support is it takes a while to get used to not being tethered to minions, right? If you're playing mid lane or if you're playing ADC or if you're playing top, you're tethered to minions. If you're playing jungle, you're tethered towards your jungle camps. You have to kind of play in relation to that. As a support, your best benefit is you get to go apply pressure wherever you have the most positive impact. So if that's top, you just go top, right? You don't have to kind of play bottom. If it's mid, you just go mid, right? You just go to your strong side. And the second con is kind of getting used to the minion waves, and the wave management is going to be slightly different because the lane's longer. But since there's so many people, the wave management isn't as punishing as it is like, say, top lane. And once you get used to the bushes, oh man, the laning is really good. So support is the most commonly recommended. This is what I would recommend you start with if you don't have an idea and you don't want to play ADC because it sounds too like mechanically hard. And for champions to pick up, just pick up something simple. I really like Karma. She's a super good poke mage, super good early pressure. This is usually who I play if I'm off-rolled. Nautilus, he's probably the most simple engage support. This is who I play support if my team needs an engage support. And then for a third one, I was struggling to come up with a third one. These are my two favorite. I would really start with these two if you guys don't know where to start. But something simple, Seraphine, Soraka, all these guys are good. I would stay away from the one-trick champions. The one-trick champions are very complex. They're hard to get down mechanically. They're very punishing if you don't know the matchups. That's stuff like Bard and Thresh and Pyke. I would not play that stuff. But these are all nice little simple picks. And this is where support is a very good starting spot. Okay, top lane. Oh boy, do I have some words for top lane. I think top lane is the most commonly misunderstood because people are like, oh, mid lane, top lane is just mid lane, but it's longer, right? And it's like, no. Top lane is the most overrated, and I think it's way more complicated, and I do not think it's good for mid laners to play secondary. Top lane is way more punishing than mid. If you have a little bit less knowledge, you get punished for it 10 times harder because it's so matchup reliant and it's so high tempo. You're by yourself, right? If they get a freeze on you, it's going to last for 3.5, 4 minutes of game time, right? That's 8 waves. You're just gone, right? That you can't really do anything about. Where mid, if they get a freeze against you because you don't know what you're doing, your jungler will help you crash it. Or the lane, it's hard to maintain the freeze. You'll just get it under eventually. It may only last for 1 or 2 or 3 waves. So it's way more punishing. The wave management is way different because the lane is longer. There's, slow builds can last a lot longer. Freezes can last a lot longer and happen in different spots and look a lot different. And you could play with the bushes because the bushes are actually in the lane. So the spots where you could be aggressive at are different. Just the whole way that the minions work in top lane is fundamentally different. And the role is very matchup reliant, right? We don't get to use our mid lane macro. It's very much one-on-one, very head-on, high interaction, very matchup dependent bruiser versus bruiser stuff. I really do not like when my mid laners play top lane secondary, unless if your mid champ can also go top, then maybe you have an exception, right? So let's say you're a Yone main and you just love Yone. And every single game of League, you just want to play Yone, then it would be okay for you to put top secondary, right? Because then you could play Yone second, you can still be learning. But it's still going to require you to learn all these different skills. You're going to have to learn how to, you're going to have to learn way different matchups. You're going to have to learn how to manage a way different kind of manifesting wave. And then the second pro is that like the trading fundamentals are very similar. The whole like punishing cooldowns and keeping track of big cooldowns and medium cooldowns. That stuff is all very similar to mid lane, but I would not recommend this role unless you really like it. Part of me, like I started as a top laner and now I play Tryndamere mid and I can't even play Tryndamere top, right? If you threw me into a Masters or Grandmaster lobby, I would not be able to perform top consistently, right? My support and my ADC are way better than my top lane, even though I play a top laner, right? So I really don't enjoy top secondary. If it works for you and you're not getting as punished for it and you're doing fine on it, it's still good, right? And don't get me wrong, play what you enjoy first, right? But if you guys are going to play top, make sure you stick to the simple fundamental champions, stuff like Garen. Darius is always a classic. Darius is super strong. And Mordekaiser is really good for learning the role. I would not recommend sticking to it unless you really like it. If you really like it and maybe your one trick goes top, it's okay. But otherwise, I think it's scary. So now the last role is jungle. Now, preseason just dropped, so it just got a lot of changes. Before season 13, before preseason patch, I would never recommend jungle because it requires the most knowledge to get into. Right? If you wanted to play jungle and you wanted to be proficient on a jungler, it would take about 20 hours, 25 hours of just studying before you were proficient enough on that champion to add to your pool legitimately, right? That means understanding the clear, understanding the identity, understanding how you view the lanes as your champion, and understanding like the 2v2 and the 3v3 power with the different kinds of champions in the game. It's just very, very complicated. Now, with Season 13, one of the biggest things they did is they just simplified jungle. They literally they made clearing not as important, or like knowing how to kite and whatnot not as important. They sped everybody up so you can play more champions. They also made it less punishing if you get behind. They also made it harder for you to get counter jungled. There's a lot more diversity and it's a lot simpler to get into. Because of that, I think it can be good if you like jungle. So if you really like to play jungle and you don't mind putting in the upfront practice and the upfront studying, because you're still going to have to do a little bit. It's the most unique role, which means you're going to have to understand the most going into it. But if you're okay with doing that, it's not as much anymore. Just watch an hour or two of YouTube guides and practice in normals a few times and you'll kind of get a hang for it. I'm okay with it, right? I think it has a very similar theory in terms of the pressure and macro you apply, right? Where you're pathing to, where you're strong siding, where you're putting your ganks. And it's really good for us as mid laners to help understand phantom pressure and gank timers and the other kind of jungle tracking nuances, right? So jungle teaches us very good things as a mid laner. But it's hard to get into jungle, right? I've always thought that if you could pick up jungle quickly, it would be the best role to queue secondary. But I still think it's so unique that it takes too much time to pick up secondary. If you really like jungle and you're okay with dropping that kind of initial time to learn it, I think it's a really good secondary role. I think it'll teach you a lot about mid lane and the gank timers and whatnot. But I think it makes a lot more sense for a jungle main to queue mid secondary than it makes for a mid main to queue jungle secondary. So I definitely wouldn't queue jungle secondary unless you're just in love with the role or you have like a jungle champion you really want to play. Now, if you are going to play jungle, play some simple stuff. A tank jungle who ganks a lot is really good. Something like Zac. An early ganker that teaches you the fundamentals of the role, like Xin Zhao, is really good. He has very good early pressure. He has very good early 2v2 power. He applies a lot of good pressure that you can really learn to utilize. That will teach you the role really well. I'm not a big fan of Diana, but she's nice and simple if you're off-rolled and you just want to kind of power farm. I think she's good in low elo, right? If you just want to power farm and you just want to have high CS and you want to hit level 6 and go team fight nerds, like that's really good. But don't pick it up unless you love it. Now, for my conclusion, I think if you don't already have a preference, I recommend support or ADC. I personally like ADC right now, but support I think is also really good. And pick the role that makes the most sense to you, right? Back when I was a top main, I looked at all my mid laners in my games and I thought, wow, these guys are really dumb and bad at mid lane. Mid lane is simple. Look at how easily I can play mid lane. And I beat a lot of kids and I became a mid main, right? If there's a role that you think looks simple and that you think you could do better than the people you're around, then do it, right? That's why I picked up ADC. I'm like, ADC can't be that hard. You just last hit, play off your support pressure, and then win the team fights. And it's like, yeah, right, exactly. If you think the role is as simple as that, it probably is intuitive to you, and it will probably make sense, so go play that. Don't try to force yourself to play a role that doesn't make sense to you. But let me know if you guys have any questions. I appreciate you guys watching this video. There's not a lot of content on understanding what secondary role would make sense for you. So I hope this video sheds some light on it. Let me know if this guy's helped you or if this video helped you guys. And let me know if you guys have any questions. Otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next video. Y'all have a blessed night. Peace.